I remember clearly looking at the car about to hit us, looking at the dashboard, looking at the sky and the clouds in the distance, and there was a recognition that everything that I was looking at was love, everything, infinite, and I'd never been so alive as I had been in that singular moment. The last thing I remember at that point was my head on the right side whacking into the glass of the door. I was met by, we could call it God or the higher self or like a fully objective aspect of consciousness. I had no time to think. I was very surprised because I figured I would probably seize up in fear and panic. But instead of anxiety, there was calm.
Okay, I'm here with Thomas Howell, better known as Ishtar. And Ishtar had an amazing near-death experience when he was young, and he's also had a very interesting spiritual life. Welcome, Ishtar. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much.
Oh, you suffered a great tragedy when you were 13 years old. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's boy, I'll do a little bit of setting the table here. I was playing a baseball game, sort of a preseason game. I loved summer baseball season. It was something I always looked forward to. And then I got hit by a pitch and had a broken arm. And so I was kind of disappointed and mopey and that evening I was talking with my mother before I went to bed, as was often the case. And as we were just talking about this, that, and the other thing, I had this impulse sort of move through my body in the form of a sentence. And the sentence was, are you going to die soon? And it was kind of shocking to me because I didn't, first, it was so automatic that it came through. Second, I never really worried about my mother's health. If I worried about one of my parents, it would have been more my dad. That was just not on the menu for me, and it kind of it affected her too. She was, a little bit moved by that, which also was strange to me because my mother was I think, a fairly formidable person, in terms of that sort of thing. And then, she brushed it off and kind of went back into the rational and said, yeah, no, I don't, not for a long time probably. And, you need to know that I'll always be there for you as long as you need me. I said, okay. I thought, silly question, right? Okay, I'm going to go to bed, which I did. But then I went to bed perfectly well. Then I woke up as if I was sprinting into my body. So I woke up with as if I swan dived into my body and moved it right in the morning. And it came as exactly at the time that she and my father were passing outside of my bedroom door. And so without any delay, I started shouting, there's something I have to tell you. And I said, there's something I got to tell you. And then I was so frustrated because I couldn't, it was like I lost the message that I was supposed to be delivering. I can't remember being that frustrated in my life as I was at that moment. And they had to come in and sort of chill me out. It's like, and it took about 5 minutes for me, to kind of get back to normal. And then I went and went to school, had a school day. That was the last time I saw them together as my parental unit. Uh, Came home. It was the second to last day of school. Always a good day. We went and took my sister to her new movie theater job at the edge of town. But unfortunately, as we were pulling out, we were hit by a car that was sort of obscured behind another one, and then just at the worst time for everybody involved, uh, decided to really pedal to the metal it. And so I was just looking over to my left to, have some conversation. I think I was actually going to try to negotiate the musical choice because I'd listened to a lot of Luther Vandross. That was her tape, and I was like, no more Luther Vandross for a while. and looking to my left, there was a giant, big old, like a Lincoln Town Car, right outside of my mother's door. And you know, I had no time to think. I was very surprised because I figured I would probably seize up in fear and panic. At the time, I'd have to say death was something that seemed, like the worst thing. And caused me some anxiety. But instead of anxiety, there was calm. I did have time enough to think, shit, right away. But then the second thought after that was as if I was being brought down into some calm reservoir, and it was like I really thought this life was going to be more than 13 years. It's more as if like, did I read the wrong script? I'm pretty sure this one doesn't terminate at 13, but like, okay, I guess it does, because I was pretty sure that both of our gooses were cooked right there. And then something else happened. I basically started to have my entire life shown before my run before my eyes. And this was something that a phenomena I was aware of at the time. I was always interested but very skeptical that such a thing, such a bit of compressed information could be presented. And yet there it was. And only here it was even more than what I had read about at the time, because here there was often sort of a 360 multi-point perspective that was going on in the scenes. Here I was met by, we could call it God or the higher self, or like a fully objective aspect of consciousness. It was as if I was being brought through my life by an omniscient presence, which I had felt many times before in life, but usually I sort of rejected it. I was kind of like, I'm going to do things the way I want to do them. Thanks for the advice. But here I was completely compelled to sort of join with this omniscient presence. And we went through my life, and sometimes we'd even look at it would point out a scene and it would say like, well, here, you reacted in fear. Here you were lying. You didn't have to lie there. It would have been better not to. And it wasn't in a judging or hectoring or any kind of lecture. It was just straight facts, objective. And each time we would go through one of those things, I felt total forgiveness, like a balm. And uh, through the whole process, felt like having some kind of suit that had been on me the whole time that I was ignorant of, zipped, pulled off of me. It was like I had this ill-fitting, constricting veil around me, and I had no idea, and it was just being pulled off. There are also sort of greatest hits bits, but the funny thing about those is I would not have picked them out myself. In fact, they were not like the most dominant active memories. They were little things. Like one that I remember very, very clearly was a memory of being on the playground as a 9 or 10-year-old in third grade. And, just as it was starting to drizzle into a puddle on the blacktop, I was looking into the puddle and found myself going into a mystical state of samadhi. At the time, I didn't understand that that was what was happening, but this presence said, like, right there, you know, we want more of that. That's your bullseye, basically. That's your target here, is to go into that space as much as possible going forward. And so, okay. And at the end of this life review session, uh, basically, I was taken into a space of a strong, marrow deep recognition that everything I had ever experienced, everything was in fact love or God in disguise. Every morsel of experience, the atoms in the chain link fence around the playground, the leaves on the tree, every tree that I had been, every person was this kind of wholeness, and that I was this wholeness too. And so this was happening while I was before the car even hit me. I felt like maybe I was being, pulled out in a way before, spare me some trouble, like in that film Heaven Can Wait, or whatever with Warren Beatty. But I remember clearly looking at the car about to hit us, looking at the dashboard, looking at the the sky and the clouds in the distance, and there was a recognition that everything that I was looking at was love, everything, infinite. And I'd never been so alive as I had been in that singular moment. Was Yeah, I'd never been so alive. And so right after that, boom, there's the impact of remember physically the last thing I remember at that point was my head on the right side whacking into the glass of the door. It didn't break it or crack it apparently. Didn't leave a mark, but gave me a concussion. And then the next thing after that I could remember is coming to and having the emergency services people cutting my door open with those big skill saw type things, and then going in and really pulling pulling me out of the car, putting me on a gurney, supporting my neck and my spine, doing all of that stuff. And then, my mother and I are in an ambulance together, and she calls out my name a couple times. The first time I said, I'm okay. It didn't seem to register. The second time I said that I was okay, it did seem to register because her breathing calmed down. And it was also one of those interesting things in the ambulance was that I wasn't just in my body, which, I was there, looking up with my neck restrained and the EMT asking me questions. But I was also sort of strangely at the top of the ambulance as well, kind of two places at once, but in a non-confusing way. And when my mother would say something, it would register as if it was inside my own consciousness, which I also felt was interesting. That previously in life, it was, you hear something and it's sort of out there. And so that when I said I was okay the second time, I kind of felt her sort of whoosh by, whoosh past me. And I didn't think of that, in the moment. I wasn't thinking that's my mother sort of leaving the body. If I had, I would have maybe tried to tug her down, in a sense. But that was that. Then next thing I know, I'm in the hospital, and I hear the news that my mother's gone, which was the sort of the hardest moment of my life. I think still, luckily so. That was the hardest. And so it was just tears and emotions, and on the way out of the hospital. And it was all those early stages of grief that people go through, um, for some days after that. And uh, but in some ways the incident hadn't fully left its mark yet, because then something very strange and that I wasn't expecting happened. I started to experience this vast vast silence, inside, outside, kind of everywhere. I felt sometimes it felt as if I didn't have a back of a head anymore, or a back of the heart, as if all I had to do is just sort of breathe and relax, and I was in this silence, and it was there even when I wasn't doing anything. And I felt, well, that's interesting. I figured it was shock, and I figured I must be dissociated in some way, as I had uh, the book on death and dying. And my mother, her final job in life was actually as a therapist. So she had a lot of good books on her shelf, and some of them I availed myself of to try to, sort of, see what was going on. Uh, but then more started to happen. Then I was like, okay, this must be something different than shock, because anytime I would go into that silence, I would feel this bliss and kind of electrical energy rising up the body, and going from my feet all the way up to my legs, up to the base of my spine, out my head. And I was like, well, this is interesting. If this is shock, I should have like jumped off a building, years ago. I had no idea that this is what was happening. And thirdly, I wasn't afraid of anything anymore, which I found bizarre, because I could look at my life, a reasonably easy North American life. I could look back on the previous, especially 6, 7, 8 years or so of kind of having a bit more of a separate selfing existence. And my goodness, it was marked by anxiety. And I was like, it was only without the anxiety that I realized how much was there. And so it was in this period, I was like, my God, I've been afraid. Why? I don't know. What was the deal? And I would try to bring fear back, almost because I'm weird that way. I like to experiment and play, I suppose. And whenever I would try to do it in this period, it wouldn't come, and I would start laughing. And I would try to ditch the silence and try to kind of be in what was normal, for the and it wouldn't do it. And so this was bizarre because at the same time, I was having sadness, anger, all the things like a textbook you would have when you lose a parent or lose somebody that you love, and yet they could exist at the same time. It wasn't it's like I could feel this sadness, and yet it wasn't. It was pain, but it wasn't suffering. It wasn't having a kind of a meta, sort of a meta level of suffering that I was so used to all the previous years. It was just experience. And because there's this sort of backdrop of deep, vast silence, a lot of it could sort of get metabolized very quickly and move through. At one point, I wanted to ask my dad if he was experiencing bliss, and as soon as I started the first words of the sentence came out of my mouth, a deep voice said, like, better not, better not share some of these things with the adults. We want you to, it came out as a we, like, we want you to sort of cultivate this experience, take this time, that you're experiencing these things. It'll be precious. So don't let yourself get railroaded by the adults quite yet. So I was like, okay, we'll go with that. So, that was about age 13, all of that.
You say that you had experiences ever since you were in your crib.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. It wasn't until I think it must have been 17 or 18 in a AP psychology class, which is the point where I learned I wasn't supposed to be having memories before about age 2, and yet as a child, uh, they were always sort of there. They kind of marked the time of my childhood. For instance, I remember very clearly the first time that I escaped out of my crib at night, which was a big achievement. I'd been trying sort of to pull myself over for some time, and then I figured it out, and then I dropped onto the floor. But then, unfortunately, I'd figured out the escape, but I didn't figure out how to return on my own. So I had to sleep the night on the floor under the crib, and I wasn't able to walk yet at that time. But that's not very supernatural. But those seem to come with that period as well. I would sit almost every morning. I would be up before dawn, before the first light would start to stream into my bedroom. And looking back, I think I was engaging in some kind of naturalistic meditation practice because I would sort of sit there in my little body, breathe very deeply into my stomach, and would experience this profoundly pleasurable unitive sense with everything in my environment. Uh, and so I sort of sit very happily, and then my mother would come in probably about 6 in the morning or something when the light would come on, and I'd sort of be up and at 'em already. On one of these mornings, I think I was up even extra early. I was sitting there just kind of looking at my curtains, sort of like an open-eyed meditation. And then a woman came into my room, and that was a normal thing. My little room had my crib, and then had a bed across for guests, and so sometimes my grandmother would come and sleep there. Sometimes one of my aunts would come and sleep there. So I was used to having some company every now and then. But this time was different because the lady who came into my room had a blue glow all around her, and I'd never seen her before. She had a sort of a blue patterned nightgown on with white lace trim at the top. She had curly hair that was in some ways was very similar to my maternal grandmother's, and yet she was much shorter. So from all these things as a baby, I was calculating, well, this is a new person. She didn't look at me. She came in my door. She walked right past my crib, but I felt her attention on me. I felt her a merging of presences, you could say, and I wasn't afraid at all. In fact, I felt positive regard from her, and I just kind of kept watching her as she walked. And then the thing that made this interaction was different was that she walked right through the back wall of my bedroom, and I'd never seen anyone walk through a wall before at that point in life, and so I was really kind of excited about that. I was thinking, boy, when I figure out how to get out of this crib, I'm gonna try that one. Uh, and so it wasn't, I wasn't scared at all. It wasn't traumatic. It was kind of fun and interesting. Must have been, who knows, 2, 3, 4 years later after that. But I think maybe one of the first times I was looking at a family photo album, we came to a particular page, and there was the woman who had walked in front. And it turned out that that woman was my maternal great grandmother, who had died about 18 months before I was born, something like that. My mother always would tell me, well, we unfortunately don't get to meet her, but you two would have been two peas in a pod. You two would have really gotten along. And so, perhaps I always, kind of hold skepticism and doubt about these experiences, even at the time and later. But it was fairly affecting and vivid, and that actually kind of kicked off a number of those of similar things, except not with family members and not necessarily with beings that I had such a easy simpatico with as a sort of a benevolent family member. It was, strangers coming in who were asking for help, and I could feel that. And sometimes I would see them as visually as I saw her. Other times it would be very uh, strong mental pictures in my head, mixed with strong, particular emotional experiences. But over the next years, especially up until about 7 or 8, it was very common for me to have a being come in the room. I would then close my eyes if I wasn't too freaked out, which also would happen. I would close my eyes and I would start that naturalistic meditation practice again. I would find myself going back into this vast void, and somehow this is not, there were no instructions for this. This is just sort of acting on impulse and intuition. I would somehow project that vast void out into the space in front, and present it to the ghost or the being or whatever that was with me, and then I would feel them go. I would sort of feel a whoosh, and then I would open my eyes and the room would feel very clean, and that sense. And so, this would happen. Honestly, at the time, I didn't necessarily believe it was real. I was, taught, taught skepticism fairly young, but it was almost a practical necessity to do this, because if I didn't do this, even if they were in my imagination, they would be lingering. Now looking back, I'm thinking that this wasn't just my imagination, but I think it might have been helpful for me to have that sense that it could be a vivid imagination. Otherwise, I think I would have been a little bit, more anxious as a little boy. So, that was a common sort of common occurrence in those early years.
So you started formally practicing meditation when you were 17.
Well, God, it was a long time coming because of, I went to, it took me about I think 14. Yeah, yeah. I had to have I went and had a eighth grade school year in which I basically, I think, went back to sleep in many ways, not fully, but enough to be in suffering again. And so by the time the next school year ended, I was like, okay, now that the decks are cleared, what the hell was I experiencing, last year, and how do I get back to that? So I started doing all sorts of stuff, like, I thought, well, it must be, I need to do things that scare me. So it's like, okay, let's go get in a friend's golf cart. Let's get this thing up to 20 miles, close to 20 miles per hour as we can. Now just jump out of it, because that's scary, right? And so I was doing that. It's like, I don't like heights, do I? I should climb up and maybe jump from a height. And like but then I was like, okay, that felt like it was almost a broken arm, so maybe not do that, because that'll my dad will be pissed at me if I come home with a broken arm. And then like, I'll just be honest with people. That's scary, you know. So then I just started telling people the most embarrassing things that I could muster up, and it was actually that was great. But then I ran out of embarrassing things to tell people. It's like, it's just not doing it anymore. So, I kind of gave up on that, and figured it was, just I couldn't recreate it until one day I was going into a metaphysical bookstore with my sister, and I went into the back and picked a book up at random, just to sort of pass the time, and just the page I turned to had descriptions of experiences that sounded quite similar to what I'd been experiencing, and yet this was a book about Himalayan yogis, and so I was like, wait a second, you mean there are ways and practices I could, use to get back to that, and so I was hooked at about 14, but I was also in a strange way. Um, I was a little bit nervous about certain meditation practices. Uh, I know I was nervous. I was nervous because I knew that if I went into one, I'd have to go 110%. And if I did that, I think it would have kamikazed the plans that and perhaps more my family had for me in life. And I wasn't willing quite to do that. And so in lieu of like a consistent meditation practice, I had all these a series of very interesting friends and mentors move into my town for my teen years. And so while I was kind of being a normal teenager in pretty much most ways on the side, I had these people who, looking back, were some of them may have been enlightened in a way. It was not like a formal sort of thing. It was more like I get to go hang out at the kitchen table, or I get to talk on the stoop with them, or I get to go to their qigong class, for free because I'm the kid in the gathering, and experience all these, really interesting, all this interesting stuff. So by the time I hit 17, it was like the alarm clock was going off. It's like I need to be doing a formal meditation practice or practices. And so then one day I was just like, let's do it 6 hours a day. It had to be 110% because I'm just weird that way, kind of strangely wired. And I've kind of cobbled together, things from Zen, some Taoist practice, some New Agey uh, type practice, and I'm doing these things every day. And uh, a lot of it were difficult concentration practices. Uh, I remember I'm supposed to do a counting breath 1 to 10 and not think about anything else except 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And I'm supposed to do this for 40 minutes. And so I'm sitting in the oak chair at the public library, and I was like, oh God, this is so difficult, And so I remember looking at my watch, thinking, I've got to be 15 minutes in. I got to check in. Then I'm like, oh my God, it's only been 38 seconds. And it's just like, I was like, oh God, I guess I got to do this because in some ways I felt I not only owed it to myself, but I felt I owed it to my mother. In a sense, I felt that in some ways, at least between her and I, it felt like there was some kind of deal or arrangement that, she's going to be involved in this thing. I'm not thinking in a self-centered way about it, but I felt, I need to live the best life that can possibly be lived out of this. I need to make um, the sacrifice of a really extraordinary person worth something. And to me, I realized that was no longer going to look like me becoming some lawyer or a politician. And in some ways, I was like, I guess I need to try my best to follow the path of these yogis, or these Buddhas, or these different mystics that I had been sort of tuning into over the years. So I was doing these crazy discipline practices, and I was honestly probably running myself a bit ragged as well. I think there were some really interesting experiences that were happening out of this. But it would take all day. I would have to sort of almost exhaust myself. And then for about 2 minutes at the end of my last meditation, there'd be falling into this vastness that, kind of maybe a tenth of how thick it was in the near-death experience. And I was like, oh, at least, okay, that's great, But I was getting up at 3 a.m., barely eating anything, taking cold showers immediately at 3 a.m., which in Wisconsin is like really cold. It's not, it felt like ice on the body. And so I was putting myself through all that effort, and somehow I think it was probably through my first brother-in-law. I was gifted to read Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, and just opening that book, felt like some kind of darshan itself, just um, ripping my heart open and just bathing me in this light. And so I remember coming to one paragraph in particular where he says, whoever prays to Babaji, uh, he'll hear you and he'll respond. It's like, well, I don't really believe that. I'll give it a go. It's what is it? It's worth me asking. It's like buying a lottery ticket, right? So except for free. And so there I was in my last sort of my deepest point of meditation, which is usually my last one of the day at that time. I was like, okay, now we're in the best space. Let's send the message out. So I said, okay, Babaji, if you exist in the way that Yogananda says you do, maybe you'll hear this and you'll know everything about me. But as you know, I'm looking for a monastery to go after high school. I'm looking for a path, and I don't think I've quite found it yet. And I'm not even sure I'm supposed to go to a Kriya Yoga monastery either. So could you help me here? And it was, I think, the second time doing this prayer. So night number two, that immediately after putting this out of my heart, I felt this like like ball of bliss go into the top of my head. It felt like a ball of honey, electrified honey bliss. It's as good a description as I can give as any in words. And with that, there was kind of a voice there. And at first, I'm like, okay, I'm not getting possessed by some tricksy demon, am I here? Okay, I don't want to do that. It's like, no, it feels all right. Okay, I'll fight back if I need to. It's like, and then kind of this voice said like, it gave me sort of a frequency pitch. I think that I've always been a bit musically inclined in some way, so that actually worked for me. Like next time this frequency is played, that'll be your breadcrumb, basically. And you're on the right track. So just pay attention. When this comes back, that'll be your clue. It's like, okay, fair enough. All right, thank you, whoever the hell you are. And I think there was a lot more than in that ball of bliss than just that message. There was a lot of stuff I couldn't quite put into words, more like an alignment, sort of like a strengthening of something in my body that was already there. And so it was like the next day, I was coming back from I had this thing where I sort of started an environmental society. I put it in quotes because it wasn't official. It's just me going around town with a garbage bag and hot dog tongs, and I was picking up cigarette butts and cans and other stuff for either recycle or just clean the town up and clean the water way up. And so I got back from doing that, and as soon as I got onto my block, I started hearing that pitch in my head. And as I walked to my house and then turned to the front door, it got really loud as I saw my soon-to-be brother-in-law and sister there, and my brother-in-law, started as soon as he started talking, it was kind of thick. I was still skeptical of this at the time as like a method of, you know, deciding what to do in life. I was like, this seems dodgy, right? But as soon as I saw him, as soon as he started talking, it's like, whoa. And he said like, hey, we changed our plans. We were going to go do this Ishayas Ascension meditation course in Michigan, but that was canceled. So, hey, do you want to go to do this one this weekend in Minneapolis? I had money show up in my bank account, like more than I thought I had there, and it's got your name on it for the course fee. And it's like, yes, just immediately, just like a massive yes out my body. And yeah, I didn't really know much about this meditation practice except the bits that my brother-in-law had told me. And I was pretty skeptical, but I knew it was working for him because when we meditated together, I could feel, kind of, I suppose, good vibes coming off. And that was that was what really turned me into a really even more serious meditator than 6 hours of crazy asceticism. When I learned this practice, I sat down, and that it took me to the same presence, basically the same depth that I'd been in my near-death experience. And so, I kind of was brought to my spiritual home in this
This
life.
practice, this practice was allegedly created by some Tibetan monks that taught Jesus when he was there, and he took it back to Israel and taught the apostles. And the apostle John went back to Tibet with some of his apostles and created this the lineage that is known today. Is that more or less the story?
That is the big mythic story. That's the big, I'll call it the big fish story.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. That you reeled it up very well. And it was kind of like Himalayan, so it was less Tibetan, not so Buddhist kind of. It was actually tied to the he was MSI, the practice founder, short for Maharishi Sadashiva Isham, actually a TM teacher originally born in Seattle. Um, he was linking it to the Shankaracharya lineage, or to different members of the Shankaracharya uh, lineage, who then, yes, passed it to Jesus during his lost years in India, and then some, that was the mythic dimension of it. Was some bit of it was taught in Palestine, and I suppose throughout the Mediterranean world. And yeah, and I'm not quite sure. I don't usually put the gas pedal on that myth quite so much, because it's not very provable. Actually, if I had been exposed to that mythology ahead of the class, I might have been less apt perhaps to learn, because I'd be like, oh, all these people are trying to always garland their New Age thing with some very big story to try to give it credence, but it would have maybe done the opposite in my case. I probably still would have went anyhow. But yeah, that was the story. And it was interesting. I didn't put two and two together. In my life, it was kind of funny, because years before, uh, it would have been like 3 years before I was a high school student. I was visiting my sister at her college in Western Massachusetts, and we saw on a neon sign that said like Gypsy palm reading, $5. And so we walked. We like, we can afford that. $10. Yeah, that's great. So we went up to this Victorian house, and it wasn't a proper Roma person. It was more like an American's idea of what a gypsy should look like. And so it's probably like a Ukrainian lady with a costume, but her son was definitely not in costume. He had an Adidas tracksuit on. And so he was kind of like, "You'll pay now, get read." It's like, okay, here's the money. And I wasn't expecting anything, just fun. And so I gave her my palm. And at the time, I wanted to be an actor or musician. I thought I had a realistic shot at being sort of a session drummer. And I put my hand forward, and the first thing she said was, "You're absolutely not going to be actor or musician." And I was like, okay, I didn't want to help her with cold reading or anything. I figured she just assumes all young males of a certain age want to be an actor or musician. So I was like, no. She's like, no, no matter how hard you try, it's not going to happen. And I was like, well, I guess we're gonna have to agree to disagree, because actually that's exactly what I'm gonna do. And you'll see, I've got good work ethic, etc. I can, get there. And I was like, well, what do you think I'm gonna do then? And then she kind of actually went into a what looked like a very interesting space of consciousness. And because when she started talking, she didn't seem to be believing what she was telling me. It's like it was a surprise to her. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. And the thing that she told me was, well, actually, you're going to travel the world teaching the true mystical teachings of Christ. And she said true mystical teachings. She didn't say like Orthodox teachings, but I saw like an Orthodox icon on the back wall. And it's like, oh, she's a missionary now. She's just trying to get me into her fold. And so as a teenage boy, I was like, well, okay, I don't know about that. You got to know I don't have a religious bone in my body here. Not like Orthodox. No offense. We're going to agree to disagree on that. And then, years later, I come into this ascension practice, which is exactly what it was billing itself as. And I remember being on a plane one time going to teach a course, opening up, looking at the back of the book, and it said, in time for the third millennium, the true teachings of the Christ. I was like, oh, good heavens. The gypsy lady was right, after all. So, that's my little portion. It doesn't really prove the veracity of the mythos, but okay, something interesting is going on here.
So you remained with this institution for years, and you became a meditation teacher, and then
Yeah.
you left it.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I did.
What are you now? What do you consider yourself? What
I
is
consider my I consider myself probably a better meditation teacher of the same practice than I was before, and in some ways, I think probably more aligned with lineage with a capital L than I was when I was more institutionally aligned. And so I see a difference between institutional alignment. Sometimes they can be very helpful, and so I'm not shitting on institutions here. Actually, 5.5 years of my tenure, it was felt like my own Shangri-La. I mean, it felt like I was in Hogwarts, and amazing things happened, and amazing things healed or fell away that I never thought I'd ever be rid of. When I went in, I just assumed that there'd be a certain level of suffering all the time. That's life, and and they were gone. But at the same time, institutions, even ones that have, I think, very good teachers or even great teachers, uh, seem to run into human problems and seem to go a little bit too culty. I think there's maybe a scale somewhere between the Rotary Club and Jonestown. There's a lot of room between those, and I think at least for me, uh, it was definitely on the good side of the Rotary Club. Intense enough to affect transformation, but not getting into groupthink, heavy groupthink territory or any of that stuff. At a certain point, maybe it was me, maybe it was organization, probably a combination. I came back and I just realized my expiration dates come somehow. I thought I'd be with an organization for until I was carried out in a pine box. And I would have been happy to because I thought, oh, this is a good institution here. And yet shortly after having that realization, I found myself becoming more critical of stuff that I considered sort of groupthink, or more critical of sort of things that were the negative side of religious institutions cropping up. Perhaps I was just noticing them for the first time and had been asleep at the wheel. Perhaps they had increased, and I had made a promise to myself years before, inspired by a friend who was a high school teacher. He had said he'd made himself a similar promise that if he ended up as one of those uninspired high school teachers just waiting for the end of the day to click, that would be his sign to quit. So I said, oh, that's a good idea. I'll make a similar one here if I ever find myself becoming a malcontent, and and where not every day is centered in joy and silence. It's that'll be my sign. And so that day came, and I duly announced my exit, from the organization.
I have another question. Did you ever have any contact with your deceased mother, or an experience that in which you felt her presence? And can you talk about that?
Oh yes, I absolutely did. Not early on though. That was a point of great frustration for me. Because I'd seen all these other ghosts. I'm like, why can't I see my own goddamn mother? What I want to see, and I would pray and pray, and nothing would come of that. As at 13 or 14, and the first experience that was very moving and cathartic and clear came in the middle of my meditation teacher training, and this was kind of a very intensive meditation retreat where I was basically meditating between 10 and 16 hours a day with the eyes closed, depending on how much that sleep I needed. And and so somewhere in the middle, I went for a bathroom break, and I finished washing my hands, and I looked up into the mirror, and in a non-scary way, there was my mother's face, um, in my face, and it wasn't just the biological similarity that you would have. It was actually, her face right there. And it was just a sense of connecting to, I don't know, the part of the whole where our two souls were already connected and show, forever would be. And it was like a darshan. It was a sense of almost a sense of completion, like from a nod from her, like this is exactly where you were supposed to go with the plan. This is exactly why we had those events of 6 years ago. At the time, it was, I think, 6 years between the car accident and the teacher training, or 7 years. And it was, great job. And that was kind of the sense. And so that was extremely healing. I mean, it is some, it's like some tumbler down in the spine was put into place by that. So there was contact, and I had to wait another about 10 years for another significant bit of contact. I wasn't really looking for it because I figured that was that, but it came on my honeymoon, and my mother had always actually promised me that when I graduated high school, that she would take me on a trip to her favorite places in Europe, where she had, I think, significant experiences in the early 70s as a traveling student. And of course, that never happened. And so here I was with my wife. We were on honeymoon in Florence, Italy. My wife had badly sprained her ankle on a cobblestone there. We were about to climb up Giotto's tower next to the Duomo in Florence. And so, like, we were changing our plans, but then my wife was like, no, no, but I want you, I'm going to sit over here. I'm be fine, but I want you to climb that tower. So I'd actually been getting ready to climb it by climbing lots of stairs in Portland the year before, all the towers that I thought we'd be needing to climb. And so I climbed that thing, and somewhere mid climb, I just had the sense, my goodness, that these stairs are so narrow. I'm surely my feet are going over the place where my mother's feet went 40 some years ago. And it just that it came from the back of the head, that thought. And then as I was looking out, I was all alone at the very top level, looking out, a wonderful view of the rooftops of Florence and the hills in the distance at sunset. And I smelled my mother's perfume. I hadn't smelled that perfume in 17 years. And no one was around me, and there was no smell before. I was the only one there for about 2 floors. And then I felt her presence, and I felt arms from behind me wrapping around my chest. But that smell was so evocative. It just filled the atmosphere. And there weren't any telepathic words or anything like that. It was a deeper communication than it was a more of a full-bodied, emotional, grokking communication. Like, it's like, told you I'd be there. Told you I'd be here.
Wow, beautiful. So, right now, what do you do presently? You're a meditation teacher, you're an astrologer also.
Yes. Yeah.
And what do you offer? What type of services do you offer, and how can people contact you?
Yeah, so yeah, kind of two, sometimes related, sometimes not, work silos right there. The meditation's the older one, going back to my time with the Ishayas, but I teach people one-to-one, uh, in person, often over Zoom. I've sort of figured out how to do good meditation teaching via Zoom. But previously, it was all in person. I'm kind of suits my disposition. I'm kind of a vinyl over CDs guy, anyways. So it got kind of old-fashioned that way. But then I found that uh, things get transmitted, well enough, more than well enough, actually. And so I'll teach group classes sometimes, one-to-one. I also do spiritual mentoring, which can involve all sorts of things coming out. Sometimes meditation practice comes up. Sometimes it's intuitive, sort of sitting with people in presence and letting uh, intuitive capacities flow out, uh, things of that nature. So that's one side of work, and the other side is about in 2014, uh, my wife and I were in Vancouver, BC, and just kind of events collided that we ran into a lovely man who was both a Zen meditator and a uh, astrology and tarot practitioner by the name of Rob Inglis, and hit it off immediately. And I took a formal astrology class, and I was hooked. And my wife was actually a bit ahead of things. She said, "You're going to be a great professional astrologist." I'm like, "No, I'm not. I'm already disreputable enough as a meditation teacher. I mean, astrology, that's really disreputable. I mean, that's like, it's like." But sure enough, she was right. And so then I started doing astrology sessions at first for friends and coworkers, and found, okay, this is really interesting. What comes out in this, and soon found I really loved doing it. And so that line of work is usually more, I work with people who are looking to tune into their life purpose. It's not really fortune telling with me. That's not the focus so much. It's more like let me sing your soul song here, because that's what I view a birth chart as. I view people as a song, and I view a birth chart as like the sheet music that gives me all sorts of insight into how their garden of poetic verse wants to express in this life. And so it's that's the core of that work, is getting people in touch with the dharmic mission.
How can people contact you?
Well, it's best through, I have two websites, which I suppose will probably be listed somewhere in the show notes. But one's my meditation website, which is ascension-meditation.com. And the other's my astrological practice, which is awakenedlightastrology.com. And people can just send me a message through the various contact buttons through either one of those, and I'll receive it.
This has been the A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe.